Welcome to Liberty in America, Past, Present, and Future with Dr. Bill Chobe. Doc is a historian and a reenactor. On this show, you'll hear his thoughts about our personal liberties from their earliest recorded beginnings. You'll also be transported back to the 1750s to relive the life of Colonel George Washington and his adventures during the French and Indian War. Let's get started. Here's Dr. Bill Chobe.
Hello, here we go. Dr. Bill Chobe again on Liberty in America, Past, Present, and Future. This is the next one in a series. This time we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects. It's about the New World. And this is a look at history that I'm sure many of you have never thought of or considered. But it's crucial to understanding just where we got to where we are today with our freedoms and our liberties. Let's take a moment to go back and talk again about the original freedom fighters, the international freedom fighters, the Knights Templar. They were organized in the year 1118 when 9 knights of the Poor Temple Mount went to Jerusalem to try to salvage whatever treasures there were there after the Jerusalem had been sacked. Remember, prior to this, when Rome moved into Jerusalem in 70 AD and they crucified tens of thousands of Jews, some of them escaped and they made their way to Spain. They were called Sephardic. So there was a thriving culture, Jewish culture in Spain through the years. Now, when it came time of the Crusades and these 9 individuals went to find the treasures of the temple, it started a movement that eventually became international in scope. The membership was based upon a young man giving up all of his earthly wealth, taking strict vows of chastity and virtue and obedience to the group. They became well enough known as a religious group that they were eventually granted monastic status by the Pope as a monastery of sorts, a roving monastery. They had free hand to move within political boundaries within whatever countries that were existed at that time. And this freedom to move was an advantage that other political groups did not have. But they, in time, they became the guarantors of the pilgrims to Jerusalem, and they started the first travelers' checks, if you will. So if somebody was in Spain or France and wanted to go to Jerusalem, they would deposit their money in France or Spain before they left, and they received a note. And when they arrived in Jerusalem, the other members of the Templars would turn that note into cash. That way they were protected from being robbed on the way. But as I said, they became very wealthy. They had a whole fleet of ships. They owned the island of Cyprus. They became so powerful and wealthy that different countries started to borrow money from them. And as we see in the case of the French king and the Pope, they wanted more and more money to borrow. And finally, the Templars said, no, you can't do that. We're not going to give you any more. And that infuriated King Philip of France. And he, and along with the Pope, plotted to do the end of the Templars as a way to get themselves out of financial trouble. So in 1307, the Templar Knights were rounded up on Friday the 13th, and they were imprisoned, many of them tortured to death, burned at the stake with green wood to make the pain go longer, and all of their wealth was seized. When the word got out that this was happening there, then what was left of the Templars, some went north to Scotland, and some went south to Portugal. So each of those areas had Templar influence, but nothing like they had before. And as previously mentioned, Jacques de Molay, who was the Grand Master of the Templars at the time, he was tortured to recant his faith or admit that he was a heretic, which was the basis where a lot of these Templars were, excuse was used to kill him. And he then later recanted that. And he said, no, he's back to his original beliefs. And for that, they put him at the stake and set the fire on the green wood and watched him die. And while he was tied to the stake, he screamed out to the Pope and to King Philip that before the year would be over, they would die. They both died of natural causes before the end of that year. Sort of a prophecy that he made came true. And I'll leave that for your imagination of what that means, but I think it's a pretty powerful statement about what was going on at the time. So with the Templars being scattered somewhat to Scotland, as I said, and Rosslyn Chapel is there now. There's Templar influences there. But there was a group of people under Sir John Sinclair who was looking to establish the Templars in a new Jerusalem of sorts and a new land. Now, if we go and we look at North America and the discovery of North America, we know that the Vikings were here around the 12th, 11th, 12th centuries. They were aware of things, but there was some problems with travel. So there was a warming period, medieval warming period, that later became a mini ice age. And as the mini ice age came along, then it reduced their ability to travel. And this is where we get the land of Iceland and Greenland, because at one time it was warm enough to go there. But the global cooling really reduced the influence of the Vikings in establishing any permanent settlements in North America. But as the persecution continued to the Templars, they figured that they've got to find a new place. So in 1398, Prince Henry Sinclair landed on Oak Island in Nova Scotia meaning New Scotland. And it's from there it became a foothold of their activities on that area of what we call today Canada. There were different landmarks today that exist that give testimony to this. And the most recent one was Kensington Rouge Stone. It's in an area that is now Minnesota. And the Rouge Stone was found by a farmer. It's a block, a good-sized rock, if you will, that had an inscription on it that was later tied to the same kind of inscriptions found in other landmarks that the Templars left in North America. So we have, in addition to the Kensington Rouge Stone that was in Minnesota, there was also some others that were found. And today they're visible today. If you go there, there's a marker in Wexford, Connecticut, and Spirit Pond, Maine, and the Narragansett Rune Stone, RUNE stone, off the shores of Rhode Island. And these markers had different letters on them. And the one that was most curious, and it turned out later to be discovered, that the letter X in their writings had a little horizontal hook, if you will, on the right diagonal of the X. And that was later discovered to be one of the secret connections that Templars would have to one another. So if they saw a writing that had that form of an X on it, they knew that they were dealing with Templars. So there were their little secrets that only until the past couple hundred years was that discovered. But they had quite a bit of a development here, and there would have been, here much longer, if it hadn't been for the coming of the mini ice age. So the Portuguese Templars, they were down in the seafaring colleges in Portugal were world renowned, and Prince Henry was the navigators, as they called him. He had a school of sorts where they would. They were also part of the Crusades, and he was one of the students there, the Duke of Beja, Beja. He was a Templar, and he was one of the great navigators of his time, and he had learned at the feet of Prince Henry, and who was the Templar, and their whole thing was to Christianize the infidels at the highest as the highest Christian calling. Now, let me take a moment here. I want to give a reference to what I'm going to tell you next. This is from a really interesting book that I happened across in one of my readings or watching my different webinars on my screen. Dr. Miles R. Jones. This is a very fascinating man. He has done extensive research on the history of Jewish and Christian roots. In his book, Messianic Church Arising, he has the Sons of Zion versus the Sons of Greece, Volume 2. And it's from that book that I'm giving you what I'm going to tell you next, which is something I'm sure you never heard before. In Portugal, the Templars, and there's evidence there. If you ever were to travel there, there's evidence in Portugal, these Templars, where they were tunnel makers, and they had a very curious initiation rite. In order to be born again of sorts, you had to go, they stripped you down naked, maybe with a loincloth or something, and you entered into this tunnel. And the tunnel got progressively smaller until you got to the very end of it. And it was just big enough to wiggle your way through. And if you had the courage to navigate that harrowing experience in the dark, not knowing what the other end was, then you were become a Templar, and you were literally, quote, born again. So their rituals and their beliefs were very strongly tied to the Messianic Church. Now, when I talk about the Duke of Beja, he had a bastard son with a Jewish noblewoman. And that bastard son was because he was the son of this duke. He was able to, as he grew up, he was able to go to the same school of navigation that his father had gone to. And he learned all these wonderful things about what it is to trade, to read the trade winds, to see where the sea is going and that sort of thing. And his name was Salvador Fernando Zarco, Zarco. Now, because of his Jewish blood, and he was also a Templar, by the way, they call him the Knights of Christ. Because he was a Templar, and because he had access to the great navigating schools of Prince Henry, he became rather adept. This was a very fortunate thing that his to be the bastard son of the Duke. And of course, he wore all the colors of the Duke, and it opened up many doors for him. But the secret was that because his mother was Jewish, at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, the Jews were being forced to leave Spain. They were being persecuted. And this Fernando Zarco, or Salvador Fernando Zarco, feared that his lineage would be discovered, and then he would have all of his wealth seized and be imprisoned and possibly burned at the stake. So he didn't want this to happen. But see, he was like what was called a converso. And that is, he was a Jewish convert to Christianity. But because Christianity and the Catholic Church had different views as to what was the true faith, the Spanish Inquisition and the people, the Jews, that remember I said they all went to Spain after the fall of Rome, or fall of Jerusalem, 70 AD, they were severely persecuted. Their properties were seized. They were thrown in prison to languish until they died. They were tortured and on the rack or whatever have you, and fingernails burned and things like that. And in order to denounce their faith, their Jewish faith, and become faith of the prevailing inquisitors. So in order to avoid this happening to him, Salvador Fernandez Arco decided he'd best change his name, or somebody's going to figure out that he is a converso or a converted Jew to Christianity. So he changed his name to Cristobal Colon. We know him today as Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, yeah, he was a Messianic. And he, because of all the contacts that he had and growing up under the helm of the Duke, he became very well known in his seafaring skills and many opportunities for him to go. So when the time came that the Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand decided that they were going to say on October 31st, 1492, that if you don't get out of Spain, we're just going to get you. And I mean, it's meaning to all the Jewish, the conversos, and the neo-Messianics, or the new Christians, or the other Messianics who were basically Hebrew of origin. This became a real religious persecution that Columbus was very fearful of losing all that he had. So we take this now, and a time came that they had to get out of Spain, and but they needed money to make this journey. Well, the money that funded Columbus didn't come from Ferdinand and Isabel. It came from the conversos, the Jews that were converted to Messianics, and the Jews themselves. Actually, they're Hebrews. And so this is where all the money came that gave him the ships to travel to, basically to find a way to get out of trouble. And if you look at the pictures of the three ships of Columbus, the Pinta, the Maria, and the Pinta Nino, and the Santa Maria, the sails that they have, there's a red cross. That's a Templar cross. So they came across here and they established San Salvador, landed on San Salvador, and they, of course, named it in the name of our Savior. That's what that means. So this is a very much religious persecution, and a solution, a novel solution to dealing with the Inquisition and all the things that were going on in against the Templars and against the conversos, the Jews, and the Messianics. So as they came over here, what Columbus really did, that was what he really discovered. It wasn't that he discovered a new world, but because we know that was already discovered by the Vikings were here. We knew that the Sinclair was here with the Scottish Templars, and they had established different landmarks we can see today. We knew that they were here before, like 1362, I think is one of the dates that was marked. But anyhow, so we're looking at this. Here's Columbus. He figured out that if he traveled the westerlies are the winds that are the dominant movement of the wind to the west. If you went below the equator, you could pick up the westerlies, and that would take you a lot faster to wherever you're going west. Now, mind you, they left in the hurricane season. We're very close to us. So very, very, they didn't know it, but it was also not the best time to be out there in the middle of the ocean. And when he returned, he also knew that if he went above the equator, then those trade winds would carry him east. So his great discovery was that you could go west into this new land, then go east and go back home. So with that, he opened up the whole idea of people following him to the New World, which, as we well know, brought in so many different things. And of course, now they knew about South America, didn't know a whole lot about North America at the time. And Spain and Portugal both laid claim to what Columbus had found. And so they wanted a demarcation line somewhere out in the ocean that Spain claimed was theirs, and the Portuguese, of course, had a cut in it. And because of the knowledge that Christopher Columbus had, he made sure that line was favorable to the Portuguese. And today that line is pretty much the divide between Brazil and South America and the rest of South America. The people are supposedly in Brazil speak Portuguese, and the people in the rest of South America speak Spanish. But that's because of him, because of the knowledge that he had, that according to the other folks in the old country, they had no idea that there was all this land out there at the time. But that was a good move that they made. Now we have these. We have a trade pathway going, and it's something now that's known that can be done, established by Columbus. And so other neo-messianics and conversos found their way into the Caribbean part of the New World. Now, there was a lot of anger towards the Spanish at the time for what they had done to the ancestors of these new people that came. Most of the people, by the way, on the original voyage of Columbus were neo-messianics, conversos. And when the time came that the Spanish started sending their fleets over and finding all the gold, taking the gold from the Aztecs or whatever, the remnants of the original migrants that come over here with following Columbus, as looking for that safe haven from all the religious persecution in Europe, they became pirates, if you will. They would prey on the Spanish galleons to get the gold back. Basically, it was stolen from them back in Spain. And that remnant, as we know today, they were the pirates of the Caribbean. In fact, if you see the Jolly Roger, which is the skull and crossbones that the pirates' ships famously had, that skull and crossbone represented the skull and crossbones of John the Baptist, as we well know, was beheaded because of what he said to, I guess it was Pilate. So you see how this all ties together. You can't talk about liberty in America. You can't talk about the New World, the development of how we are what we are. And incidentally, there was, because of this understanding of how you could go back and forth from Europe and America, then, of course, the slave trade started up. Of course, slavery has been with us from the get-go. The Hebrews were slaves when they sold Joseph into slavery. I mean, it's been all over. Slavery exists today with sex slaves and supposed indentured servants, which is a form of slavery. So it was just as brutal. Even brutal today if we see the narco traffickers that go on with their slavery of people. Slavery's been around a long time, but once the word got out that there was a new place that needed a lot of cheap labor, then the tribes in Africa, in their warring tribes, would capture another tribe, and they would sell those their fellow countrymen to the English or the Spanish as slave trade. And of all the blacks that came out of Africa, the African Americans were only about 1/3 of all the slaves that came over. Most of them had gone into the Caribbean and into South America. But that's a side note. That's another story. But important to understand this, the origins of some of this as well. So Columbus got this big thing here. He found this great big continent. Not expecting it, but that's just what he found. And following that, there was a trove of people, coming to the New World and establishing their colonies or whatever have you. But it's when we take that to the level of where we are next on our story, the Templars. Again, Columbus and John St. Clair and others, the four Knights of the Temple Mount, that thread of living, because again, they were a monastic group that had international authority to move and became very wealthy and all. Their ideals carried through the Templars to Columbus, led to great explorations, Sinclair, great explorations. But today, they morphed into what we call the Masons. And the Masons are important because a lot of they were great builders. In fact, the Templars were the mark of the Mason was that they were stonemasons. So they built a lot of the temples, or not, I'm sorry, a lot of the churches in Europe that we see today, and they were built many castles. So they were great builders, if you will. Well, the Masons, they had a code of sorts, and because they were being persecuted and run down, killed, they naturally became very secretive, and that made them very suspicious of who they are even today. And I will admit, I'm a Mason. I'm not real active in it, but I know enough about it, having been inducted into it. But when we look at the effect that the Templars are now coming into the Masons, what that had on American liberty is that many of our founding fathers were Masons, were Freemasons. And a lot of what they did, what they put together in this country in terms of freedom was continuing the heritage of the Templars. And one of their great things that they did, in addition to believing that virtue was important, and the virtue of strength, in essence, they postulated the axiom that the state should stay out of the church. The church should not be running the state. So the separation of state from church, or church from state, was a Templar, something that we can attribute to the Masons through the Templars, because of the horrible experience that the Templars had at the hands of the Inquisitors so many centuries prior to that. So from all of this, with all that was developing in Europe, we're talking about, we're dealing with the mini ice age, which minimized a lot of the travels to the North America, but it continued through the South America. That there was a lot of other activities that developed in that area. And this is why, Columbus is often thought of as being the discoverer of America, because a lot of it was just so cold that there wasn't much going on in, say, around Nova Scotia or Oak Island. But, as we look at the Befalda series, the history of Oak Island, or the mystery of Oak Island, I should say, that's being currently filmed as a series on the History Channel. There's potential for great treasures to be found somewhere in the depths of Oak Island, but the references go back to Sinclair, 1362 or whatever have you, somewhere around that time. But the following up now, the idea that we had Masons who were pretty much the people that formed our country, and so there's like a third of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Masons. Their views, their moral views of the world and how it had been formed through their secret society, became expressed in a lot of the words we have in our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the idea later the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. So we can thank the incorporation of our liberties and freedoms that we enjoy to the strain that goes back to the poor Knights of the Temple Mount in 1118, and how that thread, that desire of freedom, you may have heard me say before, freedom is really, it's a spiritual thing. In fact, there's a scripture that says, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. If you listen to the words of our My Country 'Tis of Thee, and if you ever look at what it means, thee in My Country 'Tis of Thee is a capital T. My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee, capital T, I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. Now, there's a second verse. If I can remember, I'll give it to you. My country, God of thee, author of liberty, of thee I sing. Long may my land be bright, with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God, our King. That's it. It says it all. Look it up. It's one of my favorite songs. It really tells a story of where freedom and liberty is a spiritual thing, and it's pretty much tied directly to what we call the Judeo-Christian tradition of America. So you can't talk about liberty without understanding or to fully understand what liberty means without talking about the religious background and the struggles of different varied interpretations of what our Judeo-Christian tradition would be. Because if you exclude that, then it's just whatever you make it to be. And that, of course, is chaos. And we know that when right becomes wrong, there's chaos. Remember, might becomes right. We live in bondage. This is like Spanish Inquisition, might was right. They just, everything they said was right. If you didn't go along with it, boy, you paid a price. But when right becomes might, then we're free, such as we have in this country. So unfortunately, today we're into a time of chaos when right and wrong are, so the divisions are blurred and people are living in chaos. They don't know which way to turn. And our decisions to where we're going to be in the future depend on whether we allow might to become right, which is often thought of today with the growth of our federal government, or are we going to get back to right being might with our just laws and liberty and justice for all, if you will. Hey, thanks a lot. I'm glad you're taking the time to listen to me tonight. We'll have some more history of liberty in America the next time around. I apologize for missing a week. We had a very bad storm up here. I lost power for several days, so I certainly couldn't do what I'm doing now. But I appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit about who we are, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.